Good evening, guys. I hope you're doing well today. Today, I really want us to discuss something technical. I watched a video by a lady by the name of Mpofu, and she was basically talking about the congressional meeting that was had by the MDC and the MDC Alliance in America. Now, the question that we were all asking ourselves when we watched this meeting is, on what grounds does the opposition go and ask for the maintenance of sanctions against its country, and if that is patriotism? Now, according to the video that Mpofu made, she was basically supporting MDC. And she was supporting MDC on a number of bases. The first basis being that when the sanctions were instituted in Zimbabwe, they were instituted and conditions were set for those sanctions, and the conditions for them to be removed were articulated. She also went on to say that the sanctions themselves were smart and targeted at government officials who were corrupt and not upon every single Zimbabwean. So I discovered that it seems like there's not much information and knowledge about what is the nature of the sanctions that Zimbabwe is under. And so today I want to make a video in which I am addressing that issue of Zimbabwean sanctions. And because of the presentation that Chuoneso did, it was a very articulate, organized presentation. I'm going to attempt to do the same here. So Chuoneso suggests that the sanctions that are placed on Zimbabwe are justified, and the MDC is justified to go to America and sit in front of Congress and ask for the maintenance of those sanctions. And she said the reason they are legitimate is because Zimbabwe must have free and fair elections, and not only free and fair elections, they must meet the terms and conditions that instituted the sanctions in the first place. And also, she believes that those sanctions are not harming anyone in Zimbabwe, but they're only harming politicians. Now the question, is this true? What were the sanctions all about? What were these sanctions that everybody talks about? The sanctions themselves are referred to as Zidera Act of 2001. And my understanding and reading of that document, which is referred to as S.494, is as follows. It says in the motivation for the sanctions and in the statement that is written by the Congress of America in the Act as follows. It is the policy of the United States government to help the people of Zimbabwe effect peaceful democratic change, to achieve broad-based economic growth, restore the rule of law. It then goes on in that very document, the Act Zidera 2001, to motivate and give a background of the nature of the sanctions and where they stem from or where they come from for the Congress to reach its conclusion to make those sanctions. They go on to say, financial mismanagement for Zimbabwe's participation in the War of Congo has made Zimbabwe ineligible to be a part of the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development and the IMF, all of which would be taking part in the development and modernization of the Zimbabwean economy. They go on to then say the people of Zimbabwe have thus been denied the economic and democratic benefits envisaged by the donors of such programs. I will try and put that in a nutshell for you. So the United States government, before they talk about the nature of sanctions that they've imposed on Zimbabwe, go on to articulate that in 1999, basically from 1999 to 2000, the Zimbabwe was removed from the multilateral lending institutions of the world. And it was removed because of its participation in the war in Congo. Right. They then go and say, the Congress that is, they've made findings that in 1999 all the way to 2000, the IMF and other multilateral institutions suspended the participation of Zimbabwe in these institutions, where all loans, lines of credit, credit guarantees, forgiveness of debt, in line with the structural adjustment programs, and the funding that had been approved for the development of projects and infrastructure in Zimbabwe had been suspended. So this is the background of the US Congress sitting to start looking at putting sanctions upon Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe had been suspended from these multilateral organizations before the US decides to put sanctions. But it is very critical and important for you to understand that the United States government itself is the biggest donor and the biggest contributor to the IMF. And so they've got executive directors who sit on the board of the IMF with the influence and power to tell that body what to do. So it is clear already that the United States Congress, before sitting, had already sent its directors and executive directors to the IMF to suspend Zimbabwe from participation in those organizations. Now, then they go and explain what their sanctions shall be. Now, they say, and the heading of the sanctions is support for democratic transition and economic recovery. The US directs its executive director to vote against any restructuring, cancellation, reduction, or extension of debt to Zimbabwe until the following conditions are met. Now, the sanctions have been proposed, and the sanctions that have been proposed in Zidera by the Congress are for democratic transition and economic recovery. And we've already heard that the policy itself that was behind these sanctions was to institute democratic change. So when the government says that the sanctions were put to bring the regime change, they are correct because it is within the wording of the sanctions themselves. So these are the conditions that the United States government says it will only accept to remove the sanctions. Rule of law comes back into Zimbabwe, including the respect and ownership of title of property. From there, they go to say respect freedom of speech, freedom of association, end to lawlessness, violence, intimidation sponsored by the government and the ruling party and their supporters. The government has held free and fair presidential elections, so you must understand the context. They were making these sanctions in 2001, so they were saying that the government must hold free and fair elections in 2002 that are observed and are accepted by international observers. They then go and say pre-election conditions are to the standard acceptable to international standards of freedom of movement. And the last condition, commitment to land reform that is done in a transparent, orderly manner in line with the agreements on the Land Reform and Resettlement Conference in Harare in 1998. So 1998, there had been a conference about how land must be taken, about how land must be redistributed. We must remember the context is that this conference was only happening after Britain reneged on the terms and conditions of Lancaster House. Therefore, Zimbabwe decided to take land by force because Britain would not give the money for that land to be taken. So there was a conference that was held in Harare in 1998. That conference was called Land Reform and Resettlement Conference. So now let's put into perspective all the issues that I have brought up about the terms of these sanctions, the source of these sanctions, and what it is that were the terms and conditions for these sanctions to be suspended. So they talk about the rule of law. The rule of law, which is attached to the ownership and title of property. For me, this is the crux of what the sanctions were really about. The issue of land and the issue of Zimbabwe going into Congo to fight in Congo, where they were disturbing the rebels that were being funded by Rwanda and Uganda, which were being funded by Western powers. This is the issue and cause of the sanctions. So they also then go and talk about the respect of freedom of speech, freedom of association, and the lawlessness and the violence and intimidation that is supported by government and the ruling party. I've got a number of problems with that. Where did this violence, intimidation take place? How was it proved? Which body proved that there were this violence and intimidation that was taking place that was sponsored by the government? And indeed, if it is by the ruling party, can the government of Zimbabwe be sanctioned because ruling party members have undertaken violence? Does it become the indictment of a government and its people because of the actions that have taken place? Another question that I've got is that, is Zimbabwe the first country in which violence is taking place during elections? And I'll give you context. Right now in South Africa, 92 politicians have been killed just in KwaZulu-Natal because of political violence. Do we then have to put South Africa under sanctions? Because Zimbabwe is said to have had 40 people that died in the parliamentary elections that are taking place in 2000. Kenya, 500 people died in the elections. Did we put sanctions on Kenya because of that? Freedom of speech. Is there freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia, which is a partner to the United States? Is there freedom of speech in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates? Is there freedom of speech in Uganda, which is another partner of the United States that took part in the Congolese war, sponsoring rebels that were trying to overthrow a legitimate sitting government? From there, we talk about the free and fair elections. Whose standard determines free and fair elections in Zimbabwe? And the reason I ask this is that the sanctions were put in reference to the elections, the parliamentary elections that had happened in Zimbabwe in the year 2000. But what are the facts about those elections? We need to consider that in these elections, just before those elections, there was an MDC alliance that was against the new referendum to change the constitution. The MDC alliance won. They were able to defeat the government of Zimbabwe and prevent it from changing the constitution. And this was just a couple of months before the elections. Now, my question is, if Zimbabwe is this country that was so unfair, a country that did not allow freedom of speech, and a country that was not allowing an environment for free and fair elections, how is it that the MDC alliance was able to defeat this very same government in a referendum? Why was this government unable to win this referendum and defeat the MDC through violence, through not allowing freedom of speech? How did MDC campaign for the public not to vote for this constitutional change if they didn't have the freedom of speech and the freedom of movement? We then also go and look at the election itself. MDC contested 120 constituencies in the country. All the constituencies that ZANU-PF was in, they contested. How did they contest those constituencies if there were no free and fair elections and if there was no freedom of movement and freedom of speech? Then what is more interesting is the results of these elections. MDC got 57 seats and ZANU-PF got 62 seats. ZANU-PF won by 4 seats. Now the question is, if there's no freedom of movement, if there's no freedom of speech, if there's no freedom of campaigning, how is it that people even knew to vote for MDC in a manner that would make the election so close by only 4 votes? And not only that, we also go and see that the election observers, there were election observers from Africa, there were election observers from outside Africa. There were election observers from the AU, from SADC, and the Commonwealth. Although some observers were dismissed from the country because of the tensions that were between the West and Zimbabwe because of the land program that had just taken place. My argument is that the land program was the reason for the sanctions. The participation of Zimbabwe in Congo in preventing these Western-sponsored rebels from overthrowing Laurent Kabila was one of the major reasons why the West was angry with Zimbabwe and wanted to punish Zimbabwe and came up with these frivolous excuses. However, of the election observers that were there, SADC, AU, said that they believed that the elections were free and fair. They had issues, there were problems, but they were generally free and fair. But I'm not going to look at that because as Zimbabweans, you generally prefer when information comes from international communities. So I'm going to read for you what the Commonwealth Observer Group wrote. Now, the Commonwealth Observer Group is not an African group. It's a multinational group in which England is the mother of the Commonwealth. And they said, in our conclusion, in short, we consider that while there were some positive factors in these elections, there were also some serious shortcomings. We believe that the most important thing is democracy in Zimbabwe has taken a major step forward in the process which has enabled parties and individuals of differing political persuasions to win election into the legislature, one of the most fundamental pillars in government. So basically, what happened in 2000 elections, what happened in the parliamentary elections of 2000 was something unprecedented in Zimbabwe. And the Commonwealth Observer Group felt that this was progress for Zimbabwe. So now, if these are the things that happened in that election, a year before the US sanctions, where is it that the United States felt that Zimbabwe did not handle free and fair elections? How is it that the United States felt that Zimbabwean government had not allowed freedom of speech, yet a referendum had been won by the opposition, and the opposition won enough seats and just 4 away from the ruling party? If the ruling party had not allowed freedom of speech and freedom of movement, how is it that the opposition, for the first time in the history of Zimbabwe, came so close to defeating the ruling party? And then we also go to the aspect, who is international observers? Because the United States just recently went to Kenya where there were elections. John Kerry and his team, which were the United States contingency, said that the elections were free and fair. And after saying that, the Supreme Court in Kenya said that those elections were not free and fair. South African observers said they were free and fair. The United States said they were free and fair. And other groups from international community said that those elections were free and fair, only for the Constitutional Court in Kenya to say it not. Then what qualifies the Americans as the only observers who can determine whether elections were free and fair, yet they have said that elections are free and fair when they were indeed not? Then we come from there and we now say, so, in context of what I've read for you about these sanctions, are these sanctions smart? Are they targeted? According to Chiwoneso herself, she says that the elections have not affected ZANU-PF officials, and in fact ZANU-PF officials have become richer and they've amassed more wealth ever since the sanctions than any other time before. So they're affecting the man on the street. But I thought you guys said that these sanctions were targeted. If these sanctions were targeted, how is it that they are not affecting the ZANU-PF people they're targeted at, but they are affecting the nation of Zimbabwe and the poorest citizens? Why is it that there's no medicine in the hospitals? Why is it that our roads are in disrepair? Why is it that we cannot update our electricity infrastructure? It was put in the preamble of the act that I read for you that we have been suspended from the multilateral institutions that give us the development money that allow us to be able to develop ourselves and to modernize. And the United States, through its directors and executives, had deliberately stopped our country from participating in the IMF and these multilateral institutions in order to put the country on a back foot. Why? They said it was because of elections. I've just read for you that the elections were basically very free and fair. They were well contested. The government had been defeated in a referendum vote. It already shows that there were conditions that were conducive for the opposition to contest the government. So the election story for me begins not to hold water. So what is left? Congo is left. Why were they having issue with Zimbabwe's participation in Congo? And why is Zimbabwe's participation in Congo an issue? According to Chiwoneso and the opposition, it is because Mugabe took a unilateral decision to send soldiers into Congo. Nothing could be further from the truth. Because there is an institution called the Organ of SADC, in which Namibia and Zimbabwe South Africa, Botswana, and a number of other SADC states are a member. Congo, when Kabila started being attacked, he approached the SADC organ and members in that institution and asked for protection from the rebels that were being sent from Rwanda and Uganda, sponsored by the Rwandese government and the Ugandan government, to overthrow him because he didn't allow officers and top military officials from those countries into his government. The Ugandan government and the Rwandan government were trying to force Laurent Kabila to put rebels into his government, Ugandan rebels and Rwandese rebels, because they helped him to secure power from Mobutu Sese Seko. But Kabila refused. But not only that, the Rwandese and the Ugandans wanted their people to sit in the Kabila government because they were being sponsored by the Americans and the Europeans to rape and pillage resources from Congo for the benefit of American companies, and Kabila wanted to close that down. So Mugabe was invited together with the whole of the SADC organ. Some of the members of the SADC organ said that they were not able to participate. Some of them were not sure whether they should participate, but 3 nations within the SADC organ agreed to participate in the war in Congo. These are Namibia and Angola and Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe did not go in to Congo alone. Zimbabwe did not go in because of some private agreement between Mugabe and Kabila. This was actually a proposal that was done in a conference that was held in Harare. Not only were they joined by these 2 nations, they were also joined by Chad and Libya from the north, who also believed that there was some neo-colonialism taking place in Congo, and so they needed to put their forces in there to prevent Kabila from being overthrown by US interests and European interests. That's why Mugabe went there. But it was not the first time for Mugabe to go into a country to defend the sovereignty of the region. He had done the same thing in Mozambique and succeeded in bringing peace in Mozambique by destroying the rebels that were in Mozambique. So now today, you will see that there are peacekeeping forces in Congo because of a conference that then happened in Sun City, South Africa, after Zimbabwe's participation with Angola, Egypt, Angola, Libya, Namibia, and Chad to defend Kabila. Kabila was not removed from power. But because of not being removed from power, because of the stalemate that was there, negotiations took place in South Africa, and now we've got peacekeeping forces from South Africa, Malawi, and so forth in Congo. So Zimbabwe had a legitimate reason to be there. Pillaging might have happened. Soldiers within the army might have been naughty. Senior officials might have done things they were not supposed to do, but that does not illegitimize the reason why Zimbabwe was in Congo. So now another thing that is being talked about is that the sanctions are legitimate. But are they legal? These sanctions by the United States, are they in convention? Are they in line with the legalities of international law and the institutions of trade like GATT and WTO? Well, WTO says that its mandate is for international trade to take place. Nations must conduct trade on a basis of non-discrimination. Nations should maintain government restrictions in the movement of goods at a minimum, and change should reduce restrictions more than increase them. Nations should discuss and agree on the conditions of trade, including the level of tariffs and other restrictions within the multilateral framework. And however, so the question now is we have to ask ourselves is, United States government going against Zimbabwe and going to institute these sanctions, was it something that was agreed upon by any other multilateral institution like the UN and other members of the world besides our previous colonial masters and America, which happens to finance our previous colonial masters? Was it legal for America to discriminate and to put Zimbabwe on the sidelines from having access to finance, from having access to structural adjustment programs and funding to develop itself to keep competitive in the world? The truth of the matter is, according to the GATT and the WHO, World Trade Organization rules, it is not legal. However, there is a section 61 in the GATT rules that says that a nation can take action to protect its national security interests against another nation. And this is where I believe our sanctions fall under. national security interest. But what national security interest did America have in Zimbabwe? What national security interest did America have in Zimbabwe to lie that our elections were not free and fair in 2000 when they were? What national security interest did America have on the land reform program, which was happening only because the United Kingdom, against international law, had reneged on its obligations? What national security interest did America have on Zimbabwe being in Congo? These are the questions that we as Zimbabweans have got to ask to understand the context, nature, spirit behind the elections. But these are the things we don't do. So when you look at it, you'll understand that there was national interest for America in Congo because it was funding the rebels from Rwanda and Uganda. They've been funding them ever since. They're still funding them now. And 5 million Congolese have been killed between the Second Congo War and today because of their resources, because of rebels that are being funded from Rwanda and Uganda by the United States and the Europeans, who have jets that continue to fly into Congo to pillage the resources of Congo. The coltan that is in our phones is leaving Congo illegitimately, illegally, to places like America. We then come from there and said it was the land issue. But the land issue was an issue that was supposed to happen. And the reason why there was a conference in Harare is because Mugabe had put out a notice that he was going to take land by force because the British were refusing to give him money. The international donors, and particularly Western countries, decided to sit with Zimbabwe, have a conference with Zimbabwe to talk about this. My question is, why have a conference where there was already an agreement during Lancaster when a contravention to the rules of that contract are happening because of the British not taking their part? Well, the Western leaders wanted to exert their hegemony on Zimbabwe and have renegotiations. But what the government of Zimbabwe did is they refused at this conference to acquiesce to new conditions because they said that you're not doing us a favor by giving us the money to take our land. It is an obligation from the loss of the liberation war. It is an obligation because of the fact that colonization was a crime against humanity and the people of Zimbabwe. So they were refusing the terms and the new terms that the Europeans and the Americans were trying to put on the table for new money to be released. Zimbabwe was saying, we've already got a standing contract. We've already got a standing contract recognized in international law, which is the Lancaster House Conference Agreement. And that is what we should hold on to. The British must give us the money for us to take land. That did not make the Americans happy. And so the Americans went and asked the IMF to remove Zimbabwe from to remove Zimbabwe and from all other multilateral institutions in the world. When they did that, when they no longer allowed Zimbabwe to get debt and loans from the IMF, Zimbabwe could not repay some of its loans because part of the assistance that comes from places like IMF is to ensure that countries can be able to continue their balance of payments. So now let's also go back and say, but why was Zimbabwe in a position where it had to be given loans by the IMF? This is where, again, our opposition have got double standards. And the double standards say to me that when Zimbabwe won our liberation war, a liberation war that was fought against a country that and a people that had instituted a war, a crime against humanity in Zimbabwe for 90 years, Zimbabwe in the Lancaster House Conference should have been able to ask for reparations. Reparations are international law. There is an international precedence. Germany went and colonized France for 6 years during the Second World War. And for that, Germany paid reparations that are in excess of $500 billion. You need to understand that Zimbabwe had 70% of its revenue leaving for a period of 90 years going to the United Kingdom. When you guys say that Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa, people in Zimbabwe were starving. They had marasmus, they had kwashiorkor, they had beriberi, and all these other malnutritional diseases because food that was being grown in Zimbabwe by white farmers was not feeding Zimbabweans but was being exported to the United Kingdom. Our people did not take up guns to fight the British because the British were good leaders and because people were eating and were satisfied. People were hungry. People were dying of hunger. People were malnourished. That's why they fought this government, that very same white government, they went to look for weapons, they went to train in Mozambique, they left their families because they were oppressed. They were starved. The economy was not doing as well as people sound and try to make it sound. Then we have an issue of corruption. When Chiwoneso made an argument, she talked about how there is corruption in Zimbabwe. And she said that Zimbabwe loses $5 million a day in the economy to corruption. But what she didn't put in context is the fact that for 90 years, Zimbabwe had been losing 70% of her revenue, leaving and going to develop the United Kingdom. That was corruption that has every bearing on the situation that caused our government to go to the IMF. If our government had been compensated, if reparations had been paid, if damages had been paid for all the pillage that happened in Zimbabwe and the lack of development that took place during colonialism, our government, which had to now build new schools, you need to understand that by the time we got into power, Zimbabwe had only 4,000 graduates, most of whom were not trained in Zimbabwe but were trained outside Zimbabwe. Of that, they had 200 high schools, 60% of which were white. And they had only 1,200 primary schools. The Zimbabwe government between 1980, and this is what the Rhodesians had done in 90 years, but the Zimbabwe government comes into power. From 1980 to 2000, they had built 1,400 secondary schools and high schools. They had then gone to build another 2,600 primary schools. On sanitation issues, the country and black people only had, 12% of them had access to toilets and water. But after 20 years, from 1980 to 2000, our government had 56% of its people with water, access to water and sanitation. Our universities, the University of Zimbabwe in 1980 used to take 300 students. And of those 300 students, less than 40 of them would be black. And those black would include Chinese, Indians, coloreds, and blacks. But right now, we've got 30,000 graduates that leave Zimbabwe. All this investment that made Zimbabwe the most literate society in Africa, that made us one of the most educated people in Africa, was because of investment by this very same government. But that investment was coming from a base of almost nothing. The Rhodesians had looted the coffers. The Rhodesians had used the coffers of Zimbabwe to finance the war against our ancestors so that they couldn't get independence. The Rhodesian government had ensured that it had exported or externalized close to 70 to 80% of the revenue that was generated by Zimbabweans to England. And with that, our government came in to build from zero, to try and incorporate in the economy the 96% of the people that had been excluded by the Rhodesian government. People don't usually consider that. And having done that, this very same government created business people. Our entire telecom sector is owned by Zimbabweans, controlled by Zimbabweans, because this government and its indigenization policy protected the telecoms industry for only Zimbabwean investment. Strive Masiwa is not a product of his own genius. Strive Masiwa is a product of the policies of this government to develop black business people into technical sectors. He was protected from the competition of Orange, of Vodafone, of Vodacom in South Africa, MTN, because the government deliberately saved that space of the telecoms industry and many other industries for black Zimbabweans. The reason we've got Boca tobacco auction floors is because of the policy of this government to ensure that it allows a black player to come into an area that was monopolized by white people. The banking sector in Zimbabwe, one of the few countries that started to have black-owned banks, with people like Mutumwa Mawere having black-owned banks because of the policy of this government to indigenize and transform this economy. By leaving the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe in government control, our Reserve Bank has the right and ability to make policies that allow black banks to be created. Unlike South Africa, where their Reserve Bank is privately owned, it is owned by European banks, and therefore, and those shareholders, these banks can stop black banks from coming into existence. These are the successes of this government that people sometimes forget. when they talk about corruption, sometimes they forget that we've got people who came into power never having governed before, never having had managerial positions because there was segregation. But more importantly, these are people, men and women, that had been closed out of participation in the economy, that when they came into power, they were poverty-stricken. A person that has been denied any economic progress for 40 years of their life is bound to be greedy, is bound to be corrupt, and bound to make some of the mistakes that we find. However, you must also understand that capitalism itself is corruption. The reason why the Americans are fighting the Zimbabwean government and they're fighting the Zimbabwean people, putting the Zimbabwean people under sanctions and then lying that those sanctions are smart, is because it's corruption. They want control of an economy that they have no right to control, but they are forcing it into submission by putting illegal sanctions so that they can exert their power, which is corruption. So now, we now have people talking about the falling economy. Chiwoneso goes to talk about how the economy is falling, there are no roads, but at the same time they are going to the United States to ask them to maintain sanctions that are going to stop our government from having developmental funds and loans to start taking people out of the doldrums that they've been put into illegally. The UN has already made a ruling on the sanctions that were imposed by the United States on Iran and Iraq. And they have said that those sanctions were against UN protocols. Those sanctions are against international trade and international law. But again, the United States is never held accountable, but everybody else must hold on to international law except the European nations. Which is why Robert Mugabe was saying that we need our members of Africa and other third world nations to become part members on the Security Council, so that the UN can be transformed to start having opinions of other nations to matter, rather than just the Americans and the Europeans, who were the same colonizers and enslavers of the rest of the world. So I hope I've given you context, guys, on what the sanctions were all about. I hope I have made you understand that these sanctions were not smart, but these sanctions were against the people of Zimbabwe. These sanctions were not justified because we've seen that there was nothing wrong with the 2000 parliamentary elections. We've also seen there was nothing wrong with taking our land in line with the agreements of Lancaster. And we also have seen that Zimbabwe's participation through the organ, through SADC in Congo, had nothing wrong. If any transgressions had been done, if anything had been done by people within those wars, then specific action should have been taken against those people. Hearings, inquiries should have taken so that we can see if indeed those people are guilty. I believe that the US sanctions are illegal. And for our legal-minded people, like BT, to go and sit, and the human rights expert Mavinga, who was also sitting there, to go and ask for the United States to maintain sanctions that are prejudicing the ordinary Zimbabwean, poor Zimbabweans, so that they can have free and fair elections next year, is very disingenuous, because there's no way there's going to be free and fair elections when our government is on the back foot, when the ruling party is on the back foot. Instead, what they want, like the sanctions said in their motivation, is they want regime change. Democratic regime change is what they're looking for. That automatically makes those elections, for me, not free and fair. That automatically means that our government is put on a back foot, it's prejudiced, and only the MDC is in an advantageous position to go to elections at a time where people are desperate for these sanctions to be taken off. It also says to me that the MDC have got nothing else to offer the people of Zimbabwe except to continue these unfair, illegal sanctions to put pressure for them to be put into power. That's not a government that I'm going to support. I hope this has been enlightening. I hope this makes you understand what our sanctions are all about. And let's hope that we start understanding what is going on in this neo-colonial, neoliberal political scenario that seeks to pretend like the rules that are applied are international law, when the players that are playing do not adhere to international law in their own capacity. Thank you very much.